They were the silent shadows behind emperors, men without manhood, stripped of identity, reshaped by steel and fear. In the grand palaces of ancient empires, China, Persia, Byzantium, and Rome, eunuchs walked softly behind the throne, watching everything, saying little. Their stories were not written in scrolls. Their names rarely made it into history books. And yet, they held the secrets of kings, queens, and entire empires. But who were they really? We imagine palace life as golden and elegant, filled with silk robes and precious jewels. But behind the marble walls and beneath the golden roofs were men whose lives were shattered at the hands of the system. They became spies, advisors, and gatekeepers to the most powerful figures in history. Some even ruled empires from behind the curtain. A brutal castration often done without proper care, sometimes even in secret by greedy traders who wanted to avoid paying taxes for dead slaves. If the boy survived, he was no longer considered a man. And yet, he was expected to serve kings like one. Boys as young as 7, sometimes even younger, were taken from their families, were sold into it never to return the same again. Some were captured in war, others were orphans, and many were born into poverty and traded like animals. He wouldn't try to take the throne. He wouldn't sleep with the queen. He wouldn't build a dynasty of his own. 2 emperors, eunuchs, were the perfect tools, obedient, silent, and utterly dependent. They would undergo a procedure so horrifying that most never survived it. Why did empires want eunuchs? Because a eunuch had no family, no children, and no desires. That made him, in the eyes of rulers, loyal.
Ow.
But that silence hit a storm, because many of these eunuchs would learn the power of secrets. This is the dark history of how empires created eunuchs and how eunuchs reshaped empires. But before we uncover their rise to power, we must first understand how a boy became a eunuch, and what was lost in the name of loyalty. He was just a boy, in a dusty village far from the palace walls. He played with a stick, chasing goats through fields, unaware that his fate had already been sealed. Sometimes it began with a knock on the door, at other times, with a father's shameful agreement made in silence. In poor families, a son could become a ticket to survival. In many cases, both the penis and testicles were removed entirely, using a knife, a hot blade, or even broken glass. Other times, only the testicles were cut off. But the risk was always the same: infection, bleeding, or death. The deal was simple: surrender the boy, and in return, you'd receive silver. The trader promised a better life, a future in the palace, but that future began with pain. The castration process was brutal. There were no doctors, no anesthesia, no mercy. Their voices stayed high-pitched. And so, these boys, once ordinary children, became property of the state.
Ow.
Their names were stripped away. They were given numbers, ranks, or new titles. Some never saw their families again. Others were warned. If you try to return, you die. Marked forever by pain, but trained to serve with silence and precision. Many never grew facial hair. The palace was not just a prison, it was a battlefield. And some eunuchs would learn how to fight back. Some developed soft, rounded features. These changes made them stand out and often targets of ridicule. But inside the palace, this transformation made them valuable. Others developed infections that never went away. But once healed, the boy would be inspected by palace officials. Those who passed were assigned to different areas: kitchens, stables, or, for the most prized, eunuchs. The inner palace, where the emperor's concubines and wives lived, the boy was tied down, often screaming until his voice gave out. A reed was inserted into the urethra to stop it from closing after the procedure. Some survived, many did not. For traders, a dead boy meant a financial loss. So they wrapped the wounds in ash, herbs, or wine, hoping the child would pull through. If he did, he wasn't a boy anymore. He was a eunuch. The healing process could take weeks. The pain, it could last a lifetime. Some eunuchs never regained the ability to walk properly. Many had trouble urinating. But even in survival, they were never the same. Without testosterone, their bodies changed. They could be trusted near royal women. They couldn't father children. They weren't a threat. The transformation from boy to eunuch was not just physical, it was psychological. This was not just a role, it was a life sentence. But some of these boys would rise from the dirt floors of slave caravans to the velvet halls of power. In the next part, we'll step into the forbidden world inside the palace, where a eunuch's life began all over again. For those who survived the blade and the bleeding, new life began. Behind the palace walls, in a world few outsiders ever saw, the inner court. It was a place of gold and silk, yes, but also of fear, silence, and endless watchfulness. Eunuchs were not just servants, they were shadows. They moved through the corridors quietly, always alert, never truly safe. They served meals, guarded concubines, dressed queens, raised royal children. Yet none of it was truly theirs. They belonged to no family, no bloodline, no future. They were tools of the court and they knew it. Long hours, heavy labor. They knew who the emperor trusted. They knew who he feared. Often they helped decide who lived and who didn't. Over time, these eunuchs could become more powerful than generals, more feared than ministers. No glory. A careless word could lead to exile. Or worse, death by slow slicing, a punishment reserved for betrayal. Eunuchs had no family to avenge them. If one disappeared, no one asked why. Every room had secrets, and every secret had ears. Sometimes those ears belonged to eunuchs themselves. They cleaned the emperor's chambers. They managed royal schedules. No matter how richly they dressed or how many servants they commanded, their past, their mutilation, followed them like a shadow. Others withdrew, becoming cold and calculated, the perfect palace player. Few tried to find love in secret, risking everything for a moment of connection in a life of isolation. But not all eunuchs were the same. If one stopped listening to that heartbeat, or threatened to disrupt it, they were quickly removed. The lowest ranked worked in the kitchens or stables. The mid-ranked kept palace order, carrying messages, guarding doors, maintaining the emperor's image. The highest, they were close to the throne. Personal attendants, royal secretaries, and even military advisors. For a peasant boy once worth a few silver coins, the power to command princes and queens was intoxicating. Some even gained influence over the emperor's children, acting as surrogate parents in place of the empress. But Pallas's life was dangerous. A wrong glance at a concubine could mean torture. Still, for some, the palace gave something they had never known before: control. But it came with a price. They could not marry, could not love, could not leave. Even the most powerful eunuchs were, in the eyes of others, half-men. Some tried to hide it with wealth, arrogance, or cruelty. And all the while, they kept the palace running. They were its quiet heartbeat. But some eunuchs didn't just survive the palace, they learned to manipulate it. And in the next part, we'll uncover how these once powerless men became kings in everything but name, ruling empires through whispers, ease, betrayal, and silent power. In a world where trust was rare and betrayal was currency, the eunuchs learned quickly. Power didn't come from strength, it came from knowing when to speak and when to stay silent. Some of history's most powerful men didn't wear crowns, they wore servant robes. In ancient China, a eunuch named Xiao Gao manipulated the Qin dynasty from the shadows. He whispered into the emperor's ear, eliminated rivals through forged decrees, and rewrote royal orders without ever lifting a sword. No imperial child became ruler without his approval. And in Byzantium, eunuchs served as generals, diplomats, even regents. They had no heirs, so emperors believed they were loyal. But history proved otherwise. His enemies died without ever seeing him raise a hand. But his web of lies eventually destroyed the dynasty itself. In the Ottoman Empire, Kislar Agassi, the chief black eunuch, controlled the harem and often influenced the succession of sultans. Inside the palace, information was power. Eunuchs were everywhere, attending private meetings, guarding secret rooms, passing messages between concubines and rulers. They knew who hated whom, who plotted at night, who lied to the emperor's face during the day. Court rivals would whisper, "He is only a slave, not a man." They'd demand his punishment, his removal, even his death. Those secrets died with them. Other times by planting rumors. A single accusation from a eunuch could destroy a minister's career, or lead him to execution. It's not just physical, but emotional. Because beneath the robes, behind the clever smiles, lived men who had been broken before they ever had a chance to live. And when they chose to act, the results were devastating. Sometimes they would remove a rival through poison. But this power came with constant danger. If a eunuch rose too high, he painted a target on his back. Jealous nobles and generals saw him as a threat. To survive, a powerful eunuch had to master the art of balance. Too quiet, and he'd be ignored. Too bold, and he'd be destroyed. Many were brilliant political minds, skilled in survival, manipulation, and patience. They could spend years building influence, only to lose everything in a single night. Their rise was slow, fall was sudden. But perhaps the most terrifying truth? The eunuchs often knew things no one else did. State secrets, hidden lovers, assassination plots. And when they were betrayed, tortured, or killed, they were both the architects and victims of the palace game. And as their power grew, so did their isolation. They had everything, except a place to truly belong. But behind their quiet manipulation, many eunuchs carried deep wounds. In the next part, we'll step into the darkness they rarely showed. The pain, shame, and trauma they were forced to bury under silk and obedience. From the outside, they seemed composed, polished, calm, loyal. But behind every lowered gaze and folded hand was a storm no one was allowed to see. Obedience wasn't a virtue. It was survival. They had been taught not to question, not to desire, and above all, not to feel. But pain always finds a place to hide. And in eunuchs, it lived just beneath the surface. Some tried to remember their real names in secret, whispering them under their breath at night. Others forgot entirely. They were called half-men, neither male nor female, unclean. Some were mocked in whispers. Others were used and discarded like broken tools. For most eunuchs, life was a daily performance. One where a wrong look, delayed bow, or a whisper in the wrong corridor could lead to torture or execution. But the body wasn't the only thing that was mutilated. Their identity was too. Eunuchs were not protected by law. They were the law's tools. Their lives could be taken without trial. Some became cruel, mirroring the abuse they had received. Others shrank inward, speaking only when spoken to, eyes always low, heart locked away. Their loyalty, no matter how deep, was always questioned. These were not just outbursts. What happened when a eunuch, forbidden from love, dared to feel it anyway? They were the final echoes of men who had been silenced too long. The trauma began the day they were cut, robbed of their manhood, their dignity, and often their future. Most were given new names, sometimes numbers, ranks, or cold titles like servant of the inner court. Their past lives were erased. But even as they climbed ranks or gained favor with royalty, the stain of being a eunuch never left them. One day, they might dress the empress. The next, they could be beaten on suspicion of looking at her too long. And then there was the loneliness. They could not marry, could not have children, could not form families. Any bond they made was a risk. Love, even in secret, was dangerous. Some formed quiet friendships with other eunuchs, emotional lifelines in a world that refused to see them as human. But even these were fragile. If one fell from grace, the others might be punished for association. Many eunuchs developed what today would be called PTSD, fear of loud voices, flinching at raised hands, waking from dreams soaked in sweat and silence. And yet, in this suffering, many still served with remarkable discipline, memorizing royal schedules, managing treasury accounts, keeping the empire running while the rulers basked in luxury. But this quiet pain, this invisible suffering, came at a cost. Some eunuchs cracked. There are records of eunuchs who poisoned their masters, set fire to royal chambers, or took their own lives in secret corners of the palace. Next we go deeper, beyond duty and into desire. From the outside, they seemed composed, polished, calm, loyal. But behind every lowered gaze and folded hand was a storm no one was allowed to see. Obedience wasn't a virtue. It was survival. They had been taught not to question, not to desire, and above all, not to feel. But pain always finds a place to hide. And in eunuchs, it lived just beneath the surface. Some tried to remember their real names in secret, whispering them under their breath at night. Others forgot entirely. They were called half-men, neither male nor female, unclean. Some were mocked in whispers. Others were used and discarded like broken tools. For most eunuchs, life was a daily performance. One where a wrong look, delayed bow, or a whisper in the wrong corridor could lead to torture or execution. But the body wasn't the only thing that was mutilated. Their identity was too. Eunuchs were not protected by law. They were the law's tools. Their lives could be taken without trial. Some became cruel, mirroring the abuse they had received. Others shrank inward, speaking only when spoken to, eyes always low, heart locked away. Their loyalty, no matter how deep, was always questioned. These were not just outbursts. What happened when a eunuch, forbidden from love, dared to feel it anyway? They were the final echoes of men who had been silenced too long. The trauma began the day they were cut, robbed of their manhood, their dignity, and often their future. Most were given new names, sometimes numbers, ranks, or cold titles like servant of the inner court. Their past lives were erased. But even as they climbed ranks or gained favor with royalty, the stain of being a eunuch never left them. One day, they might dress the empress. The next, they could be beaten on suspicion of looking at her too long. And then there was the loneliness. They could not marry, could not have children, could not form families. Any bond they made was a risk. Love, even in secret, was dangerous. Some formed quiet friendships with other eunuchs, emotional lifelines in a world that refused to see them as human. But even these were fragile. If one fell from grace, the others might be punished for association. Many eunuchs developed what today would be called PTSD, fear of loud voices, flinching at raised hands, waking from dreams soaked in sweat and silence. And yet, in this suffering, many still served with remarkable discipline, memorizing royal schedules, managing treasury accounts, keeping the empire running while the rulers basked in luxury. But this quiet pain, this invisible suffering, came at a cost. Some eunuchs cracked. There are records of eunuchs who poisoned their masters, set fire to royal chambers, or took their own lives in secret corners of the palace. Next we go deeper, beyond duty and into desire. They were born in silence, raised in shadow, trained to obey. But some eunuchs rose so high, even kings feared them. These were not just servants, they were makers of history. In the Ming dynasty of China, one eunuch's name echoed across continents. Zheng He, castrated at a young age. He was taken from his Muslim family and given to the imperial palace. His control over communication, visitors, and imperial routines made him more powerful than most senators. Despite never having trained as a soldier in his youth, he developed military strategies that crushed his enemies and reclaimed territories. He was proof that the absence of manhood didn't mean the absence of brilliance or courage. But this servant became something far greater, an admiral who commanded the largest naval fleet the world had ever seen, and oversaw religious endowments, giving him influence not just in politics, but in religion and culture as well. Some ruled for decades, becoming kingmakers behind the veil, but all of them had rewritten the roles they were born into. His ships sailed across Southeast Asia, India, and all the way to East Africa, decades before European explorers dared such voyages. After the death of Qin Shi Huang, Xiao Ga manipulated the line of succession, lied to the court, and executed his rivals. His deceit spiraled into chaos, igniting rebellions and ultimately collapsing the Qin dynasty. His name became a warning. Beware the eunuch with too much power. Zheng, he didn't just serve emperors. He reshaped global trade, diplomacy, and power. In the Roman Empire, Lucius Marius Maximus was a high-ranking imperial chamberlain, a eunuch who oversaw the emperor's private affairs and held sway over state matters. And in Byzantium, the empire of shifting faiths and fragile politics, eunuchs didn't just work in the court, they ruled it. Narses, a eunuch general of the 6th century, led the Byzantine army against the Ostrogoths in Italy. But power came at a price. Xiao Gao, another Chinese eunuch, became infamous for destroying the very empire he once served. And in the Ottoman Empire, the Kisler Agassi, chief black eunuch, controlled the imperial harem. These men proved that while their bodies had been broken, their minds remained sharp, ruthless, and brilliant. They held keys to royal chambers, secrets to state survival, and influence over who lived and who died. Some were wise, others were dangerous. They were no longer invisible. They became feared, respected, and sometimes even loved by the rulers they once served. But what happened when they grew old?
Ow.
When the palace grew tired of them? When whispers turned to warnings and favor turned into threat? In the next part, we explore what happened to eunuchs once their usefulness ran out. When power slipped through their fingers, silence returned to claim them. In the courts of kings and emperors, power was never permanent. One day you dined beside the throne, the next you were vanished without a trace. Others were stripped of their titles and left to beg in the streets they once ruled from the shadows. The same voices that once called them master now mocked them. "Man," they would say. "Unneeded tool." For eunuchs, this truth was colder than most, because they had no bloodline, no family, no protection. Once their usefulness ended, their erasure began. Some were cast out quietly, sent to remote provinces under the disguise of retirement. Their wealth was often seized, their homes burned, their servants reassigned. No son to carry their name, no wife to weep at their grave, no brother to honor their memory. They had served the empire, but the empire would not serve them. It was a cleansing of influence. Some were reassigned, others disappeared. Their names were erased from records, their bodies buried in unmarked graves, if at all. Without a legacy to pass on, everything they had built vanished with them. In history, they were remembered as manipulators, traitors, or footnotes. In Imperial China, the fall was especially cruel. The court's memory was short. A eunuch who once served an emperor faithfully could be accused of corruption the moment that emperor died. New regimes didn't trust old servants. Loyalty was only valued when it served the living. The dead had no defense. Many eunuchs were executed under false charges, bribery, conspiracy, treason, but their real crime, knowing too much. In the Ottoman Empire, a new sultan often ordered the replacement of his predecessor's entire harem staff, including the eunuchs. Others were taken in by fellow eunuchs, forming quiet communities on the outskirts of society. In these small circles, they shared food, stories, and grief. They remembered the names of rulers long gone, and the faces of concubines who had cried in their arms. And even those who escaped punishment were left with something worse: isolation. Old, childless, often ill from the trauma they carried, they had no one to care for them. A few managed to live out their final years in temple grounds, serving as low-ranking keepers of incense and scrolls. They spoke of glory, yes, but also of regret, because for every ounce of power they had tasted, it had come at the cost of something they could never regain: their identity. And yet even in death they remained misunderstood. Some tombs were defaced, others were never built. But what if we listened closer? What if behind the politics, the betrayal, and the silence, we found something more human? In the final part, we visit their forgotten graves and ask what legacy these silent men left behind. They lived without children. They died without monuments. And yet, their presence shaped empires, the great cities of the ancient world. From Beijing to Constantinople lie tombs without names, modest stones, faded carvings, or worse, no marker at all. These were the final resting places of the eunuchs. They advised emperors, arranged marriages, protected heirs, and even decided wars. Some historians argue that without them, certain emperors would have been overthrown long before their time. Men who had given their bodies, their loyalty, and their lives to the crown, only to be buried in silence. No royal procession, no mourners in black, no legacy passed on. But their impact still lingers. Letters passed through their hands. Reason was caught at their word. They were gatekeepers of power, even if they never wore a crown themselves. A man who gave up everything and asked for nothing in return, not even to be remembered. In China, entire dynasties were steered by the hidden hand of powerful eunuchs. In the Ottoman courts, black eunuchs managed the inner workings of the Sultan's palace, guarding not just the women, but the secrets of the state. But for centuries, their stories were told through the lens of fear or ridicule. Artists painted them as twisted manipulators. Poets mocked them as half-men. Historians skipped their names, or worse, blamed them for the fall of dynasties they tried to hold together. Only recently have scholars begun to ask deeper questions. I have no wife. I have only the moon. She listens. Some graves have been uncovered. Names matched, stories preserved. A few museums now display their artifacts, robes, ink brushes, and letters, not as oddities, but as the tools of men who once held nations together in silence. She does not judge. What did they believe? What did they hope for? Did they dream of love or simply peace? One rare discovery in a Chinese monastery reveals a eunuch's private journal. His words are simple. I have no son. In that line, we hear the cry of a man lost in duty, and yet perhaps remembrance is what they deserve most. Today, in parts of Asia and the Middle East, historians and cultural institutions are working to restore the truth. These weren't villains. They weren't saints either. They were survivors of a system that used them and forgot them. So the next time you walk through an old palace or museum and see a quiet figure standing behind the emperor's throne in a painting, look closer. You might be looking at someone who had no legacy of their own, but who shaped the legacy of an empire.